All right, so here we are. We're ready to go. Top of the hour. Thank you for joining us here on another edition of Think with a Drink. That's the weekly webinar series brought to you by the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. And tonight's topic, we are going to be talking about creating a family budget, or some of the iterations of why it's important to have or sort of work within the guidelines of a budget, if you will. So a couple of things real quick, just for some housekeeping issues. Just know the event is being recorded. Your mics should be off, and don't worry about your cameras, because the only thing that's being recorded is the presentation itself, what you see on the screen. There is a chat box, so if you do have any questions, please feel free, type them into the chat box. My co-pilot, who I will introduce in a second, he's on hand here not only to chime in, but also answer any of those questions, or certainly bring them up as they pop into the chat box. But most importantly, he's here to keep me on pace. Speaking of your pilots for tonight's journey, my name is Tom Alessi. I'm the president of the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. I have been in the financial services world for 23 years now. I'm an investment advisor. That means I act as a fiduciary whenever giving guidance or advice to any of my clients. I want to bring in our vice president. Craig, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Craig Richardson. I'm the vice president of Aries Foundation. I've been in financial services over 17 years now, and I specialize in working with families to help them identify their financial goals and help have a better relationship with their money.
And like I said, Craig will be here chiming in as we go along with this, but also if there is any questions or anything comes up, drop them in the chat box. He'll make sure that they get addressed. I told you that Think with a Drink is brought to you by the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. To learn more, you can visit our website. It's ariesfoundation.org. The mission behind the Aries Foundation is trying to help everyone have a better relationship with their money, because whether you realize it or not, you are in a relationship with your money. And just like any other personal relationship that you might have, there are behaviors and emotional triggers that can cause us to act irrationally sometimes when we're dealing with our finances. All Craig and I try to do is try to help everyone take a little bit of that emotion out of dealing with their money, dealing with their finances, to try to get better ahead and on track with their financial goals. Disclosures, I'm not going to go through the disclosures. We're a nonprofit. Just know that this is informational. You should always seek out the help and guidance of a professional, whether you're dealing with tax, legal, or financial, for advice. I got that out of the way, right? So now we get to come to the fun part of the evening. We call this Think with a Drink. The information and education that we're trying to give, we just feel like it can be done a little bit casual, a little bit more relaxed, and we can't think of a better way to do that than we have something to sip on. And for tonight's enjoyment, I am drinking Suborbital, which is described as a hazy New England style IPA with a nebula of flavor like tangerine and tropical fruit.
You have like a Pegasus Phoenix going on there.
Yeah, I have no idea what's, but I'm like, oh, you know what? I'll try it. It's from Bentwater Brewing, the folks up in Lynn. So they're local. We always like to support those local breweries out there. Craig, what are you drinking this evening?
I'm doing a Sam Adams white ale.
Oh, the Sam Adams white. Nice. Skol.
Cool. That's good.
It's definitely hazy. I don't know if you can see that when I hold it up there.
Oh yeah. That's hazy.
It's definitely hazy. That's that New England style IPA. But I don't know for the deep winter that it's something to be drinking. But certainly maybe on like a spring day or something as you head in, it's definitely got that crisp, sort of tropical feel to it.
So you're saying you're ready for spring? Is that what you're saying?
I've been ready for spring for a while. It was a nice day today. I'm ready for spring. Absolutely. All right. So let's get to the agenda. Why family budgeting is important. 5 guidelines that Craig and I sort of, give as, hey, things that you can follow. What are the components of a budget? What are the things you should be considering? What does it look like? when we look at a budget, and some ideas and being better at being a better saver, spending less, saving more, and some tips and ideas, just things to keep in mind as you're going through all of this. All right, so why having a family budget is important, right? Well, one of the things, and Craig, we talk to people all this time, right? A lot of this is realizing that how you behave or interact or act with your money and finances is something that you pass on to your children.
Oh, absolutely. Whether you mean to or not. Like I said, some families don't talk about money at all. And it's can we afford this? Can we afford that, with hazy information? Um, and, sometimes, the anxieties, your children pick up on financial anxieties, whether you talk about them directly or not. So, absolutely, your behavior affects, how your children will handle money in the future.
Right. And learning to not so much, hey, scrimp, but to save helps, right? Because these are resources that can be used for other things, or when times get tough, that there's money to tap into. And so, there's all sorts of factors that go along with it. And one of them, of course, is just the nature of the size of your family, right? So if it's just you and a spouse, okay, that's your family. Well, you're just dealing with two people. But now add, two kids, and you've doubled the size of everything.
Yeah, and I think, money can be a very abstract concept for children. It's not something that's based in, it's not like a toy, I get a
Right.
dollar bill, but what do I do with that? So, while we're not meant to get into, how to talk to kids about money today, it really is more about family, budgeting and behaviors. But I think when you're doing a family budget, it pays to, keep that in the back of your head, that, your kids, and even teenagers, may not have a really, or young adults may not have a good sense of, money at this point.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things, and we'll probably bring that back sometime later in the year, how to talk to your kids about money. That's one of the ones that we do. I always like that one. So we'll probably bring that one back up again, because it is a good conceptual thing to be bringing forward and trying to help with the next generation. So, how can budgeting help your family? Well, any budget, right? Whether we're talking about an individual, family, or business, it really does help you identify the areas in which you spend money, right? And I know people don't like to do it, Craig. Like, that's one of the things, like that whole curtailing the actual expenditure of that money into certain things, right? Non-essential items, essentially.
Yeah, I think, you got to realize that money is a finite source, no matter how much you have. And the issue is, what do you do with that source? What's important to you?
Right. And that's a very good point, because those expenses can spiral out of control very easily and very quickly.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
And having a budget, certainly puts at least, we'll call it, parameters on it, or at least gives you some context for what that expenditure should be or could be, or so it doesn't get out of control.
Absolutely.
And as we talked about, another thing that it does is it does help, like Craig said, it's sort of a strange concept for kids, the idea of money, but kids know, hey, I want this, I give it to me now thing. But when you have sort of an outline of, hey, here's what we can do, here's what we can afford, and we're talking to the children about it, you can help them grasp and understand that.
Mhm.
All right, so 5 guidelines, right, to follow. Less is more, right? So, that's it sounds like the wicked thing, right? Like less is more type, but one of the things that happens when people try to do, and the reason budgeting, for Craig and I gets really weird sometimes with dealing with it, is because people try to take on too much, right? And they try to like get down to every single nickel and dime when they start out with what they're doing, and it's an overload. You just become overburdened by it. You're not really going to follow it. You're not going to stay in that parameter. So it's more of getting sort of the larger categories, right? The things that you're spending on, a handle of those, let's call them bigger line items, right, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing too is, well, budgeting should be a constant thing you're doing, looking at and reevaluating it. I think the more you can automate some of those things so you don't have to keep reevaluating it, the better. So like, a lot of my bills are all on, auto pay, right? I review them, make sure that I'm getting the services I need, see if there's any, thing I can do to reduce it. Because of any new packages or sales or whatever else is coming out down the pike. But once I get that into my budget, then, here's what I'm going to put in for cable or cell phones or whatever that is. It's locked in, it rolls forward, and I know every month what it's going to be. So I don't have to keep, I don't have to be on it every minute of the day to make sure
Yeah.
that that's on track.
Right. And that it sort of goes hand in hand with that, when you start out and trying to do a budget and thinking about it is about being realistic, right? Realizing that, hey, if I went through this, because Craig and I do this with people all the time, we make them write down where they're spending their money. That's basically what we have when we go through with them, tell us everywhere that you're spending your money. And, sometimes there becomes this horrifying, like I spent all of this money on lunch this last month, right? And eating out or that type of thing. Well, don't suddenly think like, hey, if I was spending, $400 or $500 a month eating out because it was convenient for me and it was how my lifestyle was, that you're going to suddenly go to the next month and drop it down to $100, right? That's just not going to be a realistic achievement, right? Maybe dropping it down from 400 to 300 or 4 to 350, and then slowly weaning yourself down would be a more realistic goal.
The other thing too, Tom, is, are you getting as much pleasure out of that as you were hoping for? Is that where you want to spend your money? So if you really do enjoy, like in our case, we do a lot of networking over lunch. So to trim that down may not be, reasonable. Or like I said, you may spend time with your friends. It may be a social activity, as long as you're getting the value out of it you want. But you got to remember, there's when you're spending money in that arena, there's something else you can't spend it on.
Right.
So that's the real key there. Is it enhancing your lifestyle or taking from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other is, it says be wary of the latest fads, but we don't mean it as a fad thing. We mean it more of, there are so many apps and tools and trackers and things out there that you can get a little bit lost in. Like, I'm using this to track this, I'm using that to track that, and suddenly you're not really paying attention to what everything is doing. It's okay to have one and find something that works for you. It's just, don't be like, well, I tried this one, now I'm going to go to that one, now I'm going to go to that one, and then you get lost in it and you end up not doing what it is you intended to do.
Well, sometimes you're using that as the excuse not to do what you wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
I'll just keep playing with it, and then I don't really have to ever do it.
Right, absolutely. And then realize, hey, if it's a family, right, you're not the only person who's probably spending money. So you just want to make sure that you're having that conversation, and just make sure that everybody's on the same page with what the spending and budgeting plan is and what the expenditures are and what they're being done for. So, because, money is always the biggest fight. That's what happens. And if one party is trying to stick to a budget and the other party is out just spending like the free for all that they've been doing all along, inevitably it's going to come to a head, and it's really going to create much more problem inside everything than if you actually talk it out and have a little bit of conversation about what the game plan is and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and this is weird, Tom. You probably run into this too. A lot of people have done budgeting for, and a family dynamic for budgets can be very different from one family to the next. I've seen, some couples, and they've been married forever and they get along great, but they keep separate budgets.
Right.
You're responsible for these bills, I'm responsible for those bills. Okay, and everything's kind of sort of separate. And then I've seen it where it's all in one bucket. That's my situation. So I guess, like you said, it's got to depend on your communication and your expectations for each other. And that's the bigger part, is communication.
Right. And then just make sure that you're going in and know that this, and it'll come up later on, that it's an ongoing process. Like Craig said, this is something that it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't get taken care of overnight. Things change, life changes. So you need to be adjusting and sort of going with it, but know that those are the guidelines that'll work. It'll help you sort of stay at least in some sort of parameters with it.
Mhm.
All right. So determining your budget goals, right? So one of the things is that you should have a timeline, right, Craig? Any goal should have a timeline. There should be, an end goal in sight, whether it's short term or long term or a combination of the two.
Right. I think we talked about this. A goal without a timeline is really a wish. Right?
Yes. Right. And so you need to set those priorities and you
Mhm.
need to plan for the future. Right. And as Craig said, when we talk to people about goals, we always use SMART now because we're here in Boston. We play around with it. We always do. Usually, we're wicked smart when we do our goal planning. But goals are specific, right? They're measurable, which means, like I said, if maybe I'm spending $400 a month out to eat. I want next month I want to bring that down to 320 type of thing.
Mhm.
It's got to be attainable. It can't be that 400 down to 100 or 400 down to 50 because you're not prepared to do that yet, right? So it's got to be attainable, has to be realistic, and there's got to be a time limit on it. There's got to be to say, I'm going to do this by X date. And this is any goals, not just financial goals, any goals you're setting for yourself. It doesn't matter what they are. These are the components that will help you achieve them. You don't want them to be open. You don't want them to be broad-based. You want them to be narrow, specific, timely, measurable, and attainable, because that's what's going to help whenever you set any goals.
Mhm.
All right. Components of a budget, right? Why do you have this? What are the components, right? So what are the three things that we're dealing with, right? You have the income that's coming in, right? The money that's coming in, the expenses, the money that's going out for the stuff that you're spending it on, and then you have savings.
Hopefully.
Well, no, but that's what I mean. It's got to be a component of it. And we'll talk about savings in a little bit, but it's really those three pieces, right? So you got to know what the income you have coming in, and we'll talk about this in a second. You got to know what you're spending going out, and this is a big part of it because this is where it trips everybody up to know what you're spending your money on. And then, yes, as a component to it, even if it's nothing more than I'm trying to build up an emergency reserve account in the bank, some kind of forced savings plan.
Mhm.
Right? So predicting your monthly income. This is, in some cases for most people, right? Okay, they're on a salary. It's fairly simple. I know what I'm going to get paid every week or every month.
Right. Or hourly, whatever they work, but it's usually a predictable amount, right?
Right. Well, but then you have hourly income, which could fluctuate. It could change. You could be somebody who's working more hours one week and less hours the next week type of thing.
That's true.
You
Yep.
know, so the idea is to try to take a sampling, if that's the case, of whether it's, 1 month or 3 months or 6 months of time to say, okay, I'm going to average that out. And this is generally what I can expect to be getting on a monthly basis.
Mhm.
Again, if you've got salary, it's fairly simple. You know what's coming in. If you have a side hustle or some other gig that you're doing, that might be something that, again, you want to take more of a sort of like longer term, Craig, right? Like a 6-month type of window for that, because then you want to average it out.
Yes, right. I mean, obviously, you said the more consistent your income is, the easier it is to, to deal with cash flow. And as you said, sometimes people work seasonally for extra money. Sometimes they'll work the summers because they're off, from something else. So yeah, I think you want to get a consensus of what a larger time frame looks like, not just 30 days.
Right, right. And especially when you're dealing with that. But the idea is to get that handle on, okay, I know what's coming in.
Mhm.
Right. So now I know this is the cash that's coming in, which great. Now we have a handle on that. Now we got to figure out, what am I spending it on? Right. And for Craig and I, when we do this, we break it down really into 3 different components. You've got the must pay stuff that's got to be dealt with. That's the rent of the mortgage, that's utilities, that's groceries. And by groceries, we mean food in the house, not eating out, right? Food in the house. Those are the must pay expenses. Maybe insurance, if you own the property, own a car type of thing, you've got insurance that goes along sort of with utility. Those are things that need to be paid. That's the sort of first bucket that you direct what you're spending to. For us, we really think you should be saving money next. And then you've got your discretionary, that's the other stuff that goes on. That's clothing and entertainment and, fun stuff.
That's Taco Bell,
Yeah.
Starbucks. Yeah.
Starbucks, the lattes, yes, absolutely. But so this is the hardest, I think, Craig, right, for most, not only individuals, but certainly most families to get a handle or get the head wrapped around what are we spending on a regular basis over time.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, the regular bills, they come no matter what. The rent bills or the mortgage is coming due, you got to pay it. The electric bill is going to come in. If you don't pay it, they shut it off. So those are things that really, aside from, like I said, trying to negotiate the best rate you can on those, you know they're going to be consistent. We call them fixed expenses, right? The tough part people have is, delineating between a fixed expense and a discretionary expense. In other words, but I need my Starbucks.
Yeah.
That's a fixed expense. I have to spend that. I can't work without coffee. Or I can't just buy jeans. They have to be such and such jeans. So, that's where people get a little stuck with, between what is really discretionary and what is necessary.
Right. But it's finding that balance, that fine line between it. Look, we get the idea of, I survive on coffee, that Java is important in the world, right? So I get that. But there comes a trade-off to, well, wait a minute, is it really, that much enjoyment that I'm getting out of my $4 or $5 coffee every day that I couldn't get from, say, Cumbies and, $1 for a coffee type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just trying to find that trade-off where, yes, you can still do it, but you can do it in moderation, right? You can do it at a lesser amount, especially if we're trying to save on a regular basis or save for something specific.
Yeah, the other thing is how much you're spending on each category, especially right now, the housing market is just out of control, right? I mean, how prices are high. I mean, even though interest rates are so low at this point, that can mean people are putting a larger portion of their budget towards their home ownership than maybe they expected to. And so that's going to affect other areas.
Right. And that slides us right into, right, how does that look in terms of a break?
I didn't even know that. That's funny.
Right. So this just gives you it on a national basis, and it just talks about, all the different things and looking at it in terms of what those components are, but you can see with the larger categories there, as Craig was saying, housing becomes one of the largest, categories that's in there. Food and transportation become, big chunks of what everybody's doing. And the problem is, on a national average, you can see it, if you can, it's sort of I don't know what the burnt orange or ember or whatever that color is, but that's savings.
Yeah.
The national average is about 3%. That's what the problem is.
It's a dark, non-joyous color up there. Yes.
Correct. But it's one of those, right? So, but you have, along with it though, that's savings into the bank, because that's not health and retirement. As you can see, that's about 11% on a national average. Now, a bigger portion of that is going towards healthcare costs than it is towards retirement funds, but you still see some of that going there. But it just breaks it down and gives it a little bit of a sense of, gee, where is the money going? Like Craig said, getting a sense of what are the categories that you're spending money in.
Right. And if you've talked about in the past, Tom, through this whole COVID experience we've been going through, transportation, food, some of these other things may have shifted quite a bit. So it's a good time to reevaluate, where you've been spending your money, because as we come out of COVID, hopefully, some of these things may shift again. You may find yourself, traveling more, on the road more, a little bit of inflation for gas, so that might be more of that transportation expense.
Yeah.
So food is going up, that could be a bigger part of your budget. So it's just a really good time to really evaluate where you're spending your money.
Right. And one of the reasons we really sort of hover on that and really bring it up over and over again because for Craig and I, our belief is that you really can't save
Mhm.
until you know what you are spending. There's no way to say I'm going to save X or put away this amount of money if I don't know what I've got flowing out. Because the flip side of this is also true, is that you really shouldn't be spending until you know what you want to be saving. You've got to sort of put the two of it together to say, wait a minute, this is what I've got, as we talked about the components, right? This is what I've got coming in. Here's what I've got going out. But I want to be saving at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, in this country, Tom, too many people live in paycheck to paycheck. So
Yes.
you're right. If you don't know what you're spending, and also, I'm best of intention, I'm throwing into a savings account, but now you're behind, and you just rip it back out of the savings account because you got to catch up on a bill. Well, then you really didn't do yourself any, even maybe frustrated yourself more than anything else.
Right. It does. It becomes very, very frustrating, becomes very challenging. And like you said, from a lot of people, they just say, the heck with it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to be bothered with it.
Mhm.
So these are sort of 5 steps to be thinking about that. One of them is record. Now, whether you're using that app or that software, or you're just doing it like a lot of the people that we sit down with, they'll just be using, either the credit card or the debit card and spending everything that way because that they're tracking it. Now, so long as you're paying it off every month, then you're okay. It's when you sort of let it slide that we get into a different conversation, and that comes into debt. We're not going to deal with that in this particular case. That's a whole nother, segue that we deal with in terms of, consolidating and reducing debt. But you want to be tracking it. You want to know what you're doing on a regular basis and be tracking it. The second one, and we're going to go through the buckets in a second, but we call it what's in your buckets, right? How have you set up for savings? How are you delineating, money that's for emergency reserves versus retirement versus kids' education versus, a vacation fund? All of those things you need to be thinking about how you've got that set up. And, like we talked about, don't sweat the small stuff. Don't get yourself, if you're starting out or really trying to, consolidate and get the family budget under control, don't worry about the nickels and dimes to begin with. Figure out the larger categories like we talked about, figure out where that money is flowing to, and then start addressing, like, as Craig said, whoa, we're spending, 50% of our money on lattes. We got to, change that in terms of what we're doing.
Well, sometimes people, they'll get stuck on something and won't change because they don't want to deal with it, like auto insurance. Sometimes just by shifting from one insurance company to the other, they give you a break on the first year. You can save a few $100,
Right.
but you don't do it because it just don't feel like, it just keeps repeating itself. So you don't feel like getting into it, and so you overpay. So
Yeah. And
that's why I say you want to review.
right. And one of the things we always talk about, right, like Craig, is treat yourself like a bill, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yep. I mean, what I have found is most people are very good at paying their bills. Like I said, they don't want their electricity shut off, but they don't see themselves as a bill. They see themselves as the last thing in the room they have to take care of. The problem is when they do that and you don't have any savings, when something does become a problem, well, then you get into this other thing we call debt, which is not a good place to be either.
Right. Because you had to turn to someplace, you had to use the card or something else in terms of trying to get yourself out of it. And the last one there is be setting the smaller goals. Yes, it's a good idea to have that large goal, but it's then set smaller goals that help you achieve and get there along the way. So this is, I'm whether it's I'm trying to save, $3,000 or $5,000 into an emergency reserve fund. Well, that may seem daunting if you only have $100 in the bank. But if you say, hey, by the end of this quarter, we're here in February, I want to have that number up to, 250 or 300. And then the next quarter, I want to have it to, 600 or 700. That type of thing where you're setting smaller goals to get you to the larger goal, because psychologically, you're going to feel like you accomplished something.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I used to do, Tom, and I know some people still do it, was a Christmas club, right? You try to save $500 or $1,000 for Christmas time, and you have a little bit, we're going each week, a few bucks, and all of a sudden Christmas comes around, you have the money to buy presents.
Right.
So But what it does though is it starts changing your behavior into a saving where you see the value of saving, because you get there, you don't have to put it on a card, the money's already available, the stress is gone, and then you start seeing that as a, that mental reward, and it comes with all the physical rewards of having things in the bank and being structured. So
yeah, and actually more and more employers are actually setting up a similar type of thing, a sort of forced savings option from your paycheck that you could do to an account, which should really be just a separate account for emergency reserves. It should be separate from checking and anything that you can access with a check or debit card. The emergency reserve should be separate from that. Because the likelihood, as Craig said, you're going to tap into it at some point when it's not meant for just regular spending, it's meant for emergency reserves.
well, what's an emergency? Is Macy's post-season sale, is that an emergency?
It's a Super Bowl weekend, I need a bigger television. That's an emergency.
Definitely emergency, absolutely.
Now, emergency reserve is meant for that time when the car breaks down, there's a problem with something in the house, whether it's an appliance or the pipes or whatever, things that are unexpected circumstances. You got either, from COVID, which was what do they call that? It's not a quarantine, but it's like that. It's a
Lockdown?
no, like a layoff, but a furlough.
A furlough, oh
Yeah,
yes.
you got furloughed for 2 weeks, right? But there's no pay over that time period because it's a furlough. That's what emergency reserves is for.
Right.
And so your buckets, right? So the idea is to be thinking about where the money is that you're trying to save. And you have 3 buckets. Bucket number 1 is short term. That's emergency reserves. That's money that's being set aside for those emergency purposes, for any time that there's an expense or unexpected need. That's what you're tapping into. Bucket number 2 is what Craig and I refer to as mid-length. That's anywhere from, say, going out, maybe 6-9 months to several years. That might be, upgrading on transportation, a vacation that you want to take, possibly putting for a down payment on a home, those type of things. That's bucket number 2. Bucket number 3 is long-term. That's retirement, or if you have young children, possibly also education funding for a kid. And the idea here is you want to fill bucket number 1. You want to get that emergency reserve, right? Craig, what's the usual standard that we tell everybody for that?
3 to 6 months is
3 to 6 months of expenses.
That's correct. Yep.
We say to everybody coming out of the pandemic and the quarantine at this point, the average, what was it? The average American household has like $400 in the bank or something.
They're lucky. Yes. Yep. 400
Right.
bucks. Mm-hmm.
So our thing is to have somewhere 6 to 8 weeks of expenses. That should be the goal for bucket number 1 to start. Bucket number 2, you fill bucket number 1, and at the same time, you're putting money in buckets 2 and bucket 3, but your goal is to fill that emergency reserve first. Once that's full, now I can turn my attention and start filling buckets 2 and 3 at a faster rate until I have that emergency reserve where I have to deplete bucket number 1, then I turn back and I've got to start filling that again. But just have it in such a way where you have it in your mind that I'm allocating funds to different places. Where people get tripped up is it's all in one bucket. And then I'm scooping out for all sorts of different things. And now I don't know what I've actually been saving for, and the money's not there anymore.
Well, the other thing too, Tom, is these buckets are usually set up in different types of accounts that may or may not be good for the purpose you're using. So if your long-term goal is money going into your 401k, and now you need it for an emergency, well, now you got to jump through hoops to get it out of there. Do you take it as a loan? Do you take it as a withdrawal? Do you pay taxes? What are the penalties? So, that's why you want to make sure the money you're putting away is set up for a certain purpose.
Right, absolutely, because that's why you differentiate where they go and how accessible it is. That's the big part of that. Make sure you understand and can guide yourself through it. Some, tips to stay on track, right? Realize that budgeting is an ongoing process. This is not something you're going to write out this weekend and be done with it. Like we said, conversations have to take place. you need to adjust on an ongoing basis. You just want to make sure you understand what's there, and that, as we talked about, that you have a specific time period. It might be, look, we want to try to get a handle on what we're doing over the next, say, 2 months. And let's look back and go forward and sort of figure it out. And that way we have a timeline of what we're trying to put together. But just know what those expenses are, right? We talked about those must-pay expenses. Some of them are static, right? If you've got a mortgage, it's going to be the same number. Rent, for the most part, until they tell you it's increasing, your rent is going to be the same number. Utilities will fluctuate, right? It's cold in the winter, we're paying more with the heating, and probably air conditioning, electricity more in the summer. So just know that stuff is, that's why we say take a broader swath. Like right now, where January, February is a great time to look back and see all that you paid for 2021 and average it out. Because then you're going to have a handle on, well, we know what our average monthly expenses are now for the home, for the car, for groceries. And we have a sense of that, and we can sort of build to go forward with it. And then, as Craig said, pay yourself first. Always make sure that after those must-pay expenses, that you are in line and your savings is being taken care of, so that money is being put away on your behalf.
Because once you give it away, it's hard to get back.
It's hard to get it back once it goes. Watch the discretionary expenses. As we talked about, they can spiral out of control. They can get away from you, and then you wind up with, credit cards and credit card debt and other outstanding obligations, and that's what causes all the problems. And lastly, take action. Make sure that you're doing something, because as Craig said, what was that? A plan without goals, or goal without
Just a wish.
plan
It's a wish.
is a wish, right? Yeah. And so what we say to that is, we know that sometimes everybody needs a little help getting started, right? So what we offer everybody, the whole reason behind the Aries Foundation, is trying to help everybody have that plan, get a little better handle on it. And so all you got to do is, if you type yes into the chat box, one of us will reach out. We'll set up a time and talk to you. We're happy to do that. It's a complimentary consultation. You can ask us any questions, and we'll answer anything and try to give you a little bit of guidance, a little bit of, hey, this might be where you might want to go.
It's also nice to have an objective opinion when you're trying to work on a budget.
Right.
So
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So this is Craig and I in our more formal attire. Yes, those are TB12 jerseys. We know he's technically, I guess, retired, not retired, still retired, wanting to retire, all sorts of stuff out there. They're custom, so we have to figure out probably by next football season what we're going to do as far as jerseys, whether we go Mac Jones or something else.
49.
But that's when we're out and about and having fun and doing this stuff more. We're back in the days of live and in person. Craig, any questions in the chat box?
Nope, I think we covered everything anybody want to talk about today.
Perfect. So if you do ever have any questions, you can reach out to us. Again, go to the website, www.ariesfoundation.org, or you can email us directly. It's info@ariesfoundation.org, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. And on that note, I'm going to say thanks and have a great evening.